to Mad Cardigan Crime. My name is Brian, and I'll be your host for this podcast. And before you ask, yes, I am currently wearing a cardigan, because unlike some, I walk the walk. Since this likely is the first time we've met, I'd like to briefly tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a veteran of two branches of the U.S. military, Air Force and Army. I have lived and worked over both oceans in Europe and Asia. Since leaving the military, I've been a law enforcement officer for over 23 years, and I've served in various capacities during that time. Now, having said all that, while I have knowledge of many things, I do not claim to be the end-all authority on anything. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychiatrist, and I'm not a professor. I'm just an old cop who's seen and experienced his share of bad things. I truly hope that during these podcasts, I might be able to give you some information or insights from someone who has practical experience and not just access to the internet. And when I say experience, I mean the true sight, smell, and even taste of death. I did say taste, and if there are any veteran law enforcement listening, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Since it bears on this subject, I'm going to put the script aside and give you a personal example of what I'm talking about. More than 2 decades ago, when I was a rookie police officer in a major metropolitan department, I got a call mid-afternoon to meet a man who was worried about the welfare of his parents. The call sheet didn't elaborate much more because I believe he hung up on the 911 operator. Didn't give them too much info. Basically what he said was he hadn't seen his parents in a week or two, and he was at the house checking on them, or trying to check on them. Now, this was during the holidays, and it was exceptionally cold. Probably in the teens or the 20s, if I remember correctly. It was so long ago. The parents were elderly. If I remember right, they were in their 60s, I believe, maybe early 70s. And they had gone on a cruise between 1 and 2 weeks prior. They didn't have phones, so no one had spoken to them. No one was missing them, let's put it that way. This son had been asked to periodically check the house, but he had waited until today to do so. When he arrived, he had approached the house and saw a body in a red shirt or a sweater through a kitchen window that faced the front of the house. If I remember right, it was a full length all the way to the floor. There was some obstruction, but something was amiss in that window. Once he approached the door, he smelled something foul and panicked. He didn't think his parents were there, but he didn't know what was going on. So he returned to his car and he called the police. When I arrived, I briefly spoke to the man. My cover officer also arrived. I looked through the window and it was obstructed, but I could definitely see someone with a red sweater on, or a sliver of red sweater is what I saw on the floor. And at that close to the window, I could definitely smell an odor of decay. Now, since this event apparently occurred long ago, when you smell that kind of smell, you know that nothing recent has happened there. My cover officer and I decided to call for other officers, standard call for more backup on a case like that. But we didn't wait to enter and clear the house in case there was another victim, or you never know what you're going to find once you go through that door. Of course, this other officer, I won't name him. Actually, I don't remember his name. He was much more experienced than I was, and very wisely, he let me go in first. I took the key for the front door from the caller, but when I got to the front door, it was unlocked. Closed, but unlocked. I remember the first thing when I walked through that door with gun drawn was a cat sitting on the ground staring at me in the foyer. That smell hit me in the mouth. And it is a wholly unique smell. There is nothing like the smell of human decay. I'm sure most of you have smelled a dead animal or, something like that, a mouse dead in a garage or out and about. If you live in the country, you smell that. It does not smell like human decay. Adrenaline kept pushing me forward. Now, the house was really warm. Elderly people lived here, and it also felt warmer to me because we came in from an extreme cold outside. But I would guess it was between 75 and 78 for the heater going in the house. We entered the foyer, or I entered the foyer. He was a little bit behind me, and looked right through a dining room, which was on the front of the house, and through another doorway into the kitchen. I could see two forms lying on the linoleum floor in the kitchen. When I first saw them, I actually thought they were obese African Americans. Their skin was very dark, and they were huge. But I soon realized that what it was they were bloated and decaying, which turns the skin purple or black, purplish black, whatever you want to call it. I had to approach them. Like I said, this was adrenaline pumping. I was a young officer. This was the worst thing I'd ever seen at the time, but you never know what you're going to run into. It's almost like a horror movie. You're waiting for a jump scare. You know that every corner you turn has the potential for some terrifying image, but you don't know what it is until you do. The two bodies, I couldn't tell if they were male or female, had fallen between the refrigerator on the right and the kitchen island on the left. So they were basically obstructing the entrance into the kitchen. I made a rookie mistake, and the first thing I did was try to step over one body and then another. These bodies, because they died a violent death, had bled all over the floor, but it was linoleum, and so it wasn't carpet, it didn't sink in. And even as old as this blood was, it looked solid, okay, but it was still slick underneath. So I put a nice footprint in it and almost fell on top of the body. Once I passed that first obstacle, I turned left towards a breakfast nook that faced the back of the house, or that was in the back of the house. I could see a table, and there was a chair knocked over, and some bills and other various papers lying on the table. I entered that room and cleared it, and then turned left again to face a hallway that ran along the back of the house, pretty much the length of the house. I saw another body lying face down on very thick tile. It wasn't linoleum. It was like architectural tile on the floor. And it was right next to a sliding glass door that faced the backyard. Walked past that body. All of these people were apparently dead, or were evidently dead for a long time, so we didn't touch anything. Cleared the rest of the house, make sure there was no one in need of assistance and no suspect in the house. Then, gladly and immediately, exited that house and began taping off the crime scene. You pretty much push that crime scene out as far as you can, out into the street, because you have no idea how wide that crime, what its footprint was, okay? And we sat there and waited for the cavalry, which at that time and even now consists of supervisors, detectives, crime scenes, medical examiners, and things of that type. So the detectives and the crime scene arrived, and almost immediately we learned that a neighbor, if you're looking at the house, the neighbor to the right, had been reported missing several days earlier. The elderly female that lived in the neighboring house, she was the neighbor. She had run a medical supply business with one of her sons, adult sons. They were in a legal battle. One of them was suing each other, I don't remember which, and he was losing. So at some point, this adult son came to his mother's house. She lived alone. And they had an altercation, an argument, whatever it was, and he pulled a gun on her. She got away from him some way, ran from her house out the front door, and ran next door to this house for her neighbors to let her in. She knew them, they were friends. We suspect that the female let her in while the male was sitting in the back room or the breakfast nook at the table. The two females moved to the kitchen, not locking the front doors. There was probably some commotion as this woman entered the house, screaming and yelling, I would assume, as the son entered the front door in pursuit. He immediately shot both the females in the kitchen, and as he did and advanced into the kitchen, the man at the table got up, knocking over the chair, and tried to run to the right down the rear hallway. As he was running away, the suspect pursued and shot him. After all three people were down on the ground, hopefully dead at this point, the man went and shot them all multiple times in the head before leaving and closing, but not locking the front door. Now, a short time later, this son, racked with guilt or just knowing that he was going to be found out, took his boat out onto a nearby lake and shot himself. The initial victim, the neighbor lady, she had two other children. They arrived with their spouses because their mother was missing, and now the detectives and the police were calling them saying, "We found your mother," but they didn't elaborate on that. And they asked them to come to the house. They waited in the neighbor's house for the detectives along with the original caller, the son of the couple. The detectives, crime scene, medical examiner all arrived. Crime scene always goes in first with the detectives. Medical examiner, they wait until everything's documented. I was out front doing perimeter security this time, and I remember the detective. He was a younger man, very slick, young, probably early 30s, but he had on this full-length trench coat that was very thick. It was wool, or I don't even know what it's called, mohair or something like that. But it stood out in my mind because it was a light tan. It looked like a very expensive coat. After the detectives and everyone went in, I was assigned to the backyard at the gate for any media threat, is what you would call it. People will look over fences. People will get in the back door. Media vans start arriving once they hear on police scanners and stuff that there's been a possible homicide. So that was my job, to make sure nobody compromised the crime scene. While I was back there, I was near the rear windows and that rear glass door. I was absolutely freezing. I remember that. I don't believe I had an appropriate coat to be standing outside for hours, which I didn't expect to do when I came to work that day. But I was more than happy not to be inside that house. When crime scene came in and they took the photos they needed to, they had to flip the first body. You have to inspect the front of the body. You have to make sure nothing is under the body, okay, and then photograph it. Do all this before medical examiners remove them from the scene. Now, these are experienced, crime scene techs. These are a major metropolitan department, like I said, so you got some people that have been doing this for 20, 30 years. I mean, that's all they do is crime scene. So when they flipped that first body, it was almost comical. Not the situation, but what happened. Those hard detectives and those experienced crime scene techs went piling out of the house, out the front door. I could see them from the rear windows because of the smell from a disturbed body. That smell was bad enough when they had been resting in there. All that blood and stuff was just sitting, and it had somewhat dried. But once you move that body, it just intensifies tenfold. Once they got the first two bodies photographed and documented, they came to the body in the back hall, the male, where I was just a few feet away in the backyard and looking through that glass door. And I was obviously curious what it was going to look like when they flipped this body over. These are the most decayed body that I had ever seen at that point in my career. Now, when they flipped him towards the back door, so he was pretty much facing me. and he had basically melted into the floor. And when they flipped him up, I don't know if any of you seen those old cartoons with Bugs Bunny or whatever, and somebody gets hit in the face by a frying pan and it flattens their face. That's what this man's face looked like. There was no contour. The nose, lips, eyes, everything was mashed into the face he had laid in there for so long in liquid. Once all this was done, and once the bodies were removed, I was assigned to the neighbor's house where all of the victims' families were waiting. I was supposed to monitor them because at this point we hadn't received word that the son had committed suicide. And so them talking to each other, possible suspect and stuff like that, the detectives wanted someone over there listening to them, making sure they didn't talk too much. Don't disturb them in their grief, anything like that, but, just listen to what they were saying. So when the detective, after wandering through that house, finally came over to question them, the adult daughter of the original victim asked, "Is that my mother I smell on you?" They didn't even know she was dead at this point. I know they thought something bad had happened, but they didn't know, and the first thing that she asked was, "Is that my mother I smell on you?" And that stuck with me because I was standing right next to that detective. He didn't know what to say. He took several steps back and began to try to explain what was going on, and he took off that coat, which I'm sure had soaked up every bit of that smell. When I left that scene, I was obviously off work by then because that took up my entire shift and then some. I put that uniform in a garbage bag and never wore it again. When I went home, I was in my civilian clothes. My spouse at the time could still smell it, just on my hair and body, nothing to do with my clothing. I couldn't even smell it anymore, but that stuff seeps into every single pore. So, that is my first example of the taste of death. I'm sorry to jump the script, but I thought it was pretty relevant. Now let's get back on track and continue with introducing myself. There's only one more thing you need to know about me. Recently I suffered an injury which may force me to medically retire, and I cannot think of any way I'd rather spend my remaining productive years than talking with you folks about my passion, true crime. I'm going to set a little scene for you here. I'm sitting in my office, which is just a spare bedroom, staring at a couple of monitors which contain some very disturbing information. On the edge of my cheap desk, there currently sits a very tall glass of whiskey. For argument's sakes, we'll call this a triple. And I assure you, by the end of this podcast, you will understand why it's there. I couldn't think of any better way to begin a long series of true crime podcasts, I hope it's a long series, than to introduce you to someone that I'm labeling the first of the worst. This guy is a heavy hitter in the depravity department. I want you to meet Mr. Albert Fish. Let's talk about his origins and early life. Let's get that out of the way. He was born Hamilton Howard Fish on May 19th, 1870 in Washington, D.C. Hamilton Howard Fish. It's another serial killer with H.H. It's his first initials. We'll probably cover H.H. Holmes in a follow-up episode sometime later. In his youth, he took the name Albert from a dead sibling. I don't think he killed him, but who the hell knows with this guy. He took the name to escape the nickname Ham and Eggs from Hamilton, given to him during his time in orphanage. Fish's father was actually 43 years older than his mother and 75 years old when Fish was born. 75 years old in 1870 is a whole lot different than today. It might as well be 175. And to be that sexually active at that age may suggest a genetic, maybe hyper sex drive in Albert. I'm not a doctor, but he was still going strong at 75 years old back then. And a lot of serial killers, as you'll learn in following podcasts and stuff, they have incredible sex drives, overactive. Now, multiple examples of mental illness ran in his family, at least 7 that I was able to find, including an uncle that had mania, a paternal half-brother had schizophrenia actually, and his mother had audible and visual hallucinations. Now with Fish, you can combine this with a head injury that he suffered as a child. Now after Fish's father died in 1875 when he was 5 years old, his mother put him in St. John's orphanage. She presumably did this for financial reasons rather than any abnormal behavior at this age, since she removed him in 1880 after she got a government job, a better paying job. While in orphanage, Fish began to experience his first documented physical abuse at the hands of one of his teachers. Now with a family predisposition to mental illness, plus Fish being in his formative years, 5 to 10 years old, this is a prime time to develop some very bad habits. The teacher didn't just abuse him. It was supposedly a female, and she would whip the children's bare bodies. Some sources say the children were stripped naked and whipped, but Dr. Frederick Wortham, who interviewed Fish after his arrest, didn't say this. He said they only whipped exposed areas. Now, this process was made worse by the other children being made to watch. Now, whether this was a teacher with sadistic tendencies or a punishment socially accepted at the time is up for debate. But this may have been little Albert's first deviant lesson. Now, for whatever reason, Fish began to sexually enjoy both receiving the abuse and watching the other supposed semi-naked children being abused. Instead of the usual way the children discover sex, Playboys, the internet, or the always popular playing doctor, guilty of all those, little Albert associated with pain and suffering from the beginning. After leaving orphanage, Fish was entering his teens, and his never-ending search for more and more deviant ways to satisfy his sexual urges did not slow down. As you can imagine, going into his teens dealing with the hormones. In addition to spying on boys undressing in public bathrooms, he developed a relationship with a telegraph boy who introduced him to urophilia, which is the drinking of urine, and coprophagia, the consuming of feces. This, in my mind, indicates Fish's willingness to try increasingly extreme things for sexual gratification. During his youth, as I mentioned earlier, Fish fell from a cherry tree and suffered a head injury that was severe enough to cause him to stutter. He also wet his bed until the age of 11. Now, bedwetting is one of the 3 components of the McDonald triad, along with fire setting and animal cruelty. One or more of these behaviors has been found in the youth or formative years of a large number of serial killers. You'll hear the McDonald triad a lot in future podcasts. Now, all of these components I've covered so far in Fish's early life are piled on one another, and they create a blueprint for a future disturbed and violent individual. You can literally look at Fish in hindsight and not be surprised at all of his adult atrocities. Now, speaking of adult atrocities, let's move into adulthood. We're going to pause for whiskey. After leaving school, he briefly worked at a grocery store before finding the profession that he would keep for the remainder of his life, a house painter. In retrospect, you might think of this job as common for someone who has little training or advanced education, but Fish had very specific reasons for the career choice. Firstly, this job allowed Fish to work in usually unoccupied businesses and houses with cellars or basements, places he wouldn't be monitored. Secondly, the normal attire for this job were coveralls. Coveralls allowed Fish to wear nothing underneath, and with the flip of one or two fasteners, he could become almost instantly nude. And if a problem arose, the opposite was also true. He could be completely dressed in seconds. Lastly, and probably most disturbing, overalls were never expected to be clean or tidy. So if any type of soiling occurred, it would likely be camouflaged, be that blood, bodily fluids, anything. Now, during his 20s, Fish started his quote-unquote documented criminal career with charges of grand larceny, petty theft, and writing obscene letters. The writing of obscene letters is a common theme with this guy, and he will continue it for the rest of his life. His only conviction, however, at this time was for a single count of grand larceny, which is theft. He also had multiple stays in mental institutions where his personality was diagnosed as both abnormal and psychopathic, which makes you wonder why he was roaming the streets. But if he was not demonstrating delusions at the time or wasn't showing that he was a danger to other people, they're not going to house somebody that hadn't committed an actual crime yet. At the age of 28, Fish's mother arranged his marriage to 19-year-old Anna Mary Hoffman. Over an almost 20-year marriage, she bore him 6 children. Their names were Albert, Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry. This marriage ended when Fish's wife left him for John Straub, who was a handyman that boarded with the family. She sold everything in the house and left Fish to raise the children. Later, during his murder trial, Fish included his wife's infidelity as a cause for his behavior, among other excuses he gave. He married a few more times, but because he never divorced her, none of those marriages were legal. Now, this guy had crimes aplenty, and attempting to list his crimes and atrocities in any discernible order might be a futile effort, and that's to say the least. So I'll try it this way. I'll give you a broad overview of his almost 50-year crime spree. Then we will go back and hit the most documented and well-known crimes in more detail. As a house painter and handyman, Fish roamed through at least 23 states from Montana to New York. By his own admission, he quote-unquote had children in each of those states and estimated his number to be at least 100. Most serial killers, when they give estimates, it is so low it's ridiculous when you find out the truth. He would seduce a bride with small amounts of money, or he would simply force an attack isolated, unsupervised children, which there were many, especially in those days. He admitted to targeting those from poor classes, and especially black children, as he believed the authorities paid less attention if they were hurt or missing, which sadly was true in those days. At one point, Fish even employed a young black girl and paid her $5 regularly to provide him with little black boys. $5 was a lot of money in those days. Frequently after a particularly brutal attack, Fish would change his address to either the other end of town, another city, or another state altogether, probably depending on the severity. Now, jurisdictional coordination between law enforcement agencies barely existed in those days. There was no regular communication between them. And a missing or abused minority child did not garner the attention of a Bonnie and Clyde police killing spree, so to say. An additional thing Fish did frequently, as I mentioned before, was write obscene letters to women, whose ads he found in magazines and matrimonial agencies. These letters weren't just filth and fantasy for his sexual gratification. They were also requests for someone to share in his depravity. He would actually ask for partners who would whip young boys for and with him. One woman to whom he wrote stated he came to meet her and brought a length of clothesline and wrapping paper. When he told her he wanted to be beaten with it, the date was obviously over. He left the rope behind when he left, and when the woman registered a complaint with the advertising agency, they replied they didn't see anything to complain about. Could you imagine if that had happened today? What an uproar. Now let's talk about the crime that brought him into the light. I'm talking about the case that finally dragged this troll out from under the bridge, and it was that of little Grace Budd, with 2 Ds. In May of 1928, Grace was 9 years and 9 months old and lived with her parents and 18-year-old brother Edward, among other children, at 406 West 15th Street in Manhattan. Edward had placed an ad in the New York World which read, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country." This was not unusual at the time. Young men who wanted to get out of the house, they wanted to work, apprentice, and he was also living in very squalid conditions. They were in a basement, dark apartment. So on May 25th, Fish saw that ad, and on the 28th, he called on the Budds, presenting himself as a wealthy farmer named Frank Howard. This is an alias he often used, and he had many others. Fish later admitted his original plan was to tie Edward up before mutilating him and leaving him to bleed to death. Now, child penis mutilation was an act Fish had done many times before this. Fish promised to hire Edward and one of his friends and would send for them in a few days. Now, Fish failed to keep his promise, and sometime later, he sent a handwritten telegram apologizing and setting a date for another visit. Now, Fish returned to the Budds on June 3rd, which was a Sunday. But just before he did, he stashed what he calls his implements of hell, which consisted of a meat cleaver, butcher's knife, and a small saw wrapped in cloth. He stashed them at a newsstand nearby. At some point between his first and second visit, Fish had decided that Edward was too big and strong for him to subdue. Fish was only about 5'5", 130, I believe. He then turned his attention to Grace and stated he made up his mind to cannibalize her right there. Now, most sources say he didn't meet Grace until that second visit, but that doesn't make sense to me. Why a second visit at all if he didn't want Edward? And why hide his tools, which were obviously made for dismembering, if he hadn't met or decided to cannibalize her yet? That's just me thinking out loud. Now, Fish made up a story, supposedly on the spot, that his sister was giving her children a birthday party at an apartment building at 137th and Columbus, and he wanted to take Grace along. Grace's mother, Delia, maternal instinct, was hesitant, but her father, Albert, wanted to consent. Now, Fish seemed harmless. Like I said, he was just a small little old man. Grace didn't get to do many fun things, being stuck in that crowded, shabby little apartment. And Edward's pending job offer probably swayed Mr. Budd. Fish promised to have her home no later than 9 that evening. And so off they went, with Grace still wearing her white confirmation dress that she had come home from church in that day. Fish retrieved his disgusting bundle from the newsstand, and they proceeded to the train station. They then traveled north to what he said was Greenburgh, New York. When they arrived, Fish exited the train and forgot his bundle in the process, because of his excitement, obviously. When he called for Grace to jump down to him so they could proceed, she remembered his parcel and went to retrieve it. Now, had her innocence and consideration not caused her to do that, that train would have continued on with his tools aboard, and she might well have survived that day. Fish even admitted this during his confession. Now we come to the commission of the crime against Grace Budd. In yet another example of Fish's depravity, he sent a letter to her mother in 1934, 6 years later, in which he describes her murder in detail. To make things worse, Grace's mother was illiterate, and so her son Edward was forced to read it to her. Had Fish known this, it probably would have given him great pleasure, as Edward had been his original target. Just thinking about him suffer. I'll now read the unaltered letter in its entirety and let Fish tell this in his own words. Right after I take a sip of this. My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food in order to keep others from starving. A boy or girl under 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of a naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price. John stayed there so long he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole 2 boys, one 7, one 11. Took them to his home, stripped them naked, and tied them in a closet, then burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender. First he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass and of course the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten except head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, stewed. The little boy was next, went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street, rear right side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain inside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her, and she said she would tell her mama. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her though. I could have had I wished. She died a virgin. Another sip. Let's call that one a drink. You know, I've read that letter many times over the years in my search and as a true crime fan. This is the first time I've read it out loud, much less reading it for someone else to hear. It is not a great experience. You don't believe me? Grab a significant other in your life. Let's make it an adult. and read it to them out loud. Even if they are a true crime fan, they might look at you weird. And if they aren't, you might get put on the porch. Now that we've pushed through that, let's catch the sorry piece of shit. Now, after Grace had not returned, her parents spent a horrible, sleepless night before sending Edward to the police station to report her missing. Almost immediately, the police discovered that the wealthy farmer, Frank Howard, didn't exist. The address of his sister's apartment was also fake. On June 7th, the police sent out 1,000 flyers to police station with Grace's photo and Frank Howard's description. This tactic, of course, generated an enormous amount of fake grave sightings, or false, let's not say fake. Now, just like today, while there are many people out there who genuinely want to help, they mostly misremember or partially fabricate because they want to believe, they want to help so bad. Unfortunately, there are many more crackpots or trolls, as we call them today, who delight for some strange reason in wasting the police's time. Now, because every lead has to be checked and verified or disproven, more than 20 detectives were eventually assigned to the Grace Budd case. Out of all the garbage that the detectives had to sift through, only 2 early actual leads emerged. They found the Western Union office, where Frank Howard's message to the Budds originated, and they found the pushcart where he bought the pot cheese he brought with him. Both of these businesses were located in East Harlem, so the investigation focused there. It's a small lead, but you have to start somewhere. The manhunt for the Gray Man, as he was described, was massive, but ultimately it ended in failure. This is not an uncommon outcome for a stranger murder. Remember the crime I told you about in my early career? That was solved in the same day as the victims were found, because in the vast majority of murders, the killer is familiar with them. In this case, you don't have a suspect until you generate one. Now, the police actually arrested and charged Charles Pope in 1930 after an accusation by his estranged wife. He unfortunately spent 108 days in jail before being found not guilty at trial. Fortunately, in this case, the system, although it was slow, eventually did what it was supposed to do: find an innocent man innocent. Now, even though the case went cold, there was one detective from the Missing Persons Squad who continued to revisit the Grace Budd case over the years, and that was William King. Detective King would periodically contact Walter Winchell, who was an influential journalist and radio personality at the time, and plant a phony item about a break in the Grace Budd case, just to see if anything would shake loose. On November 2nd, 1934, Winchell wrote in his newspaper column that the Missing Persons Department expected to solve the case within 4 weeks. Luckily, at this time, something did shake loose. 10 days later, Grace Budd's mother received the infamous letter. Detective King investigated, and although the first part of the letter was unsubstantiated, I'm not even sure there was a famine at that time, 1894, in China, or at least in the Hong Kong area. The details about the Budd family and her abduction were accurate. Even more promising, the handwriting on the Grace Budd letter matched the handwriting on the now 6-year-old Western Union message, the handwritten message. Now that is what is called an aha moment, or eureka, if you prefer. I say that jokingly, but it is very hard to describe the feeling you get when something like that gives you a break in a case that is so cold. Now, the letter's envelope had a small hexagonal emblem with the initials NYPCBA, and that stood for the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. That is quite a mouthful. An emergency meeting of the members was held, and they volunteered for a handwriting test. The handwritten membership forms were also compared. Both of these leads ended in failure. As a last-ditch effort, Detective King asked the members to report anybody who had taken the stationery. That's a shot in the dark. you're asking employees if they had stolen from their association. Well, thank whoever you pray to, because a janitor came forward and admitted he had taken some paper and envelopes. He had left the stationery at his old rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street. When given Frank Howard's description, the landlady at that rooming house immediately recognized him as Albert Fish. He was an old man who had lived there for 2 months and had recently vacated. Before leaving, Fish had asked the landlady to hold a letter he was expecting from his son. I expect he moved out either because he believed Detective King's false break or because he sent the Grace Bud letter in the first place. The letter of his son, or the letter from his son, was so important not for sentimental value, but for his financial survival. His good son regularly sent money to support his poor old father. The post office intercepted Fish's letter from his son and turned it over to Detective King. Now, all Detective King could do was monitor the rooming house and hope Fish would return. He wanted to catch him in the act. He could have contacted the son, but the son was not even in the state and it would have taken a lot of time. Now, as time passed, King feared Fish had been scared off by the police presence at the rooming house, which there were probably a lot coming and going at the beginning there. Finally, on December 13th, King's patient was rewarded when he received a call from the landlady. Fish's need or greed for his son's charity had caused him to break his decades-old rule of not returning to addresses he had vacated. The landlady stalled Fish with a cup of tea while she retrieved his letter. Fish was holding this cup when Detective King entered the room. When Detective King asked the gray man if he was Albert Fish, the eater of children slowly stood and nodded. Possibly realizing he had nothing more to lose, the diminutive Fish suddenly reached into his pocket and produced a razor blade. This absurd last-ditch effort by a tiny little man enraged the probably keyed-up Detective King. Without thinking, he simply grabbed Fish's hand and twisted it sharply, saying, "I've got you now." The confession and trial. Even though Detective King took Fish's initial confession, he would ultimately be interviewed by a multitude of psychiatrists and law enforcement officials, as you can imagine. Most of these would eventually agree that Fish was the most depraved offender known at that time. The few that didn't consisted of those employed in his defense, though I doubt any of those people would trust their children with Fish. The early confession would be fed to a hungry press and populace, but it was heavily edited due to its disgusting detail. If it had been uncensored, that hungry populace probably would have thrown up. In addition to confirming the details concerning Grace Budd in the letter he wrote to her mother, he also elaborated on the events that occurred. When he purchased the train tickets to the village of Worthington in Winchester, Grace was one way only. After they arrived in Worthington and Grace had retrieved Fish's bundle for him, they walked along a remote road into a wooded area. Their destination was an abandoned 2-story house called Wisteria Cottage. Fish had lived in the area in the past and was familiar with the house. After stripping naked and calling Grace to the upstairs bedroom, he choked her to death. Now, during the strangulation, he ejaculated twice. After she was dead, he propped her head on an old paint can and decapitated her. Most of the blood spilled was collected in the paint can, which Fish later threw into the yard. I don't believe the decapitation was necessary to collect the parts of Grace that Fish wanted to eat, which mostly consisted of her lower body, nor did it facilitate disposing of her as she was ultimately just dumped next to a stone wall in the yard a few feet away. Dr. Frederick Wortham, who I mentioned earlier, was a psychiatrist who was one of the first to speak to and evaluate Fish, and he wrote a book called The Show of Violence. Since he had first-hand experience with Fish, I leaned heavily on his book doing my research. Straight to the horse's mouth, so to speak. In a paper discussing the severed head of the Medusa, Freud equates symbolically cutting off the head and castration, which was Fish's original plan for Edward. Fish, who had never read Freud, said in one of his 6 signed confessions to the police, "I thought it was a boy," referring to Grace during the murder. Now, this is admittedly over my head, but I found it interesting. He then stripped what remained of Grace's body from her confirmation dress, which I assume was no longer white, and severed her at the midsection with a butcher's knife and cleaver. He wrapped the parts of her he wanted to eat in newspaper and left the cottage. He spoke like a housewife discussing recipes, how he cooked Grace with carrots, onions, and bacon. He consumed all of her over the next 9 days in an almost continuous state of sexual excitement. At some point, he returned to Wisteria College and disposed of the remainder of her body, probably too decayed to eat or have any use to him at this time. And the dismemberment tools he used, all of it went next to the stone wall I had mentioned earlier. So not a whole lot of effort there. As soon as the confession was completed, law enforcement officials with Fish in tow proceeded to Wisteria Cottage to search for Grace's remains. While the police collected the remaining bones of Grace in the area indicated by Fish, he stood by with no emotion. An official asked Fish if he had raped Grace, and Fish, like in the letter, adamantly denied it. By the time they arrived back at the police station, the story had leaked to the press, and they had swarmed the Budd home. Detective King went and retrieved Mr. Budd and Edward to identify Fish. Unsurprisingly, Edward had to be restrained when he threw himself at Fish, yelling, "You old bastard, you dirty son of a bitch," and I don't blame him a bit. I would have gotten to him. Jurisdictionally, Fish would only be charged with kidnapping in New York City. Since the actual murder was committed in Worthington, his premeditated murder trial was held in White Plains, New York on March 11, 1935. Judge Frederick Close presided over the battle between Chief Assistant District Attorney Elbert Gallagher and Fish's defense attorney James Dempsey. I do not envy that man. With the multiple confessions and overwhelming evidence against Fish, his attorney's only realistic course of action was an insanity plea. I won't bore you with an in-depth retelling of a 10-day trial, so let's just focus on the highlights. Firstly, since we're talking about an insanity plea, we naturally have to discuss the McNaughton rules, another term you're going to hear in other podcasts. Basically, the defense has to clearly prove that at the time of committing the act, the party accused was laboring under such a defect of reason, from disease of the mind, as not to know the nature and quality of the act he was doing, or if he did know it, that he did not know it was wrong. So in essence, Fish's defense attorney was going to have to prove that either an insane man with no touch of reality could deceive a girl's parents in order to abduct her, bring tools used for dissection, buy that girl a one-way ticket for a 40-minute train ride to an abandoned house, strip his clothes off to keep them from getting bloody, murder, dismember, cook, and eat her in his apartment over 9 days, then dispose of the evidence without anyone noticing, or be totally sane during that entire sequence until he snaps just before wrapping his hands around Grace's neck. Then, after she's dead, snap back to sanity and explain why a sane man would commit the cannibalism and evidence disposal. That was going to be a job right there. Now, on the opposite side, the problem that District Attorney Gallagher was going to have solely had to do with the time period in which they lived. Now, today, Fish's perversions and depravities are a click of a mouse away, and as long as consenting adults are involved, they are widely viewed as acceptable. Although for a majority, that acceptable view comes with a look of disgust. In 1935, however, almost none outside of the mental health community even knew some of these perversions existed. Couple all those deviant behaviors with the murder and eating of a child, and the general public might not well believe someone like that could exist. And if he shouldn't exist, he must be abnormal and hence insane. The two attorneys went back and forth trying to convince the jury of their views of Fish's behavior. They argued over his multiple visits to mental hospitals and their conflicting diagnoses. But as you will see in other podcasts and other cases, there is always conflicting diagnoses. They argued over reasons behind his behaviors, which Fish provided many and varied, including religious mania and his wife's infidelity, as I mentioned earlier. Simple logic dictates that when you're trying to give an excuse for something, the more of them you change and add, the less believable any of them become. Now, Dempsey closed the defense's remarks by reminding the jury it was the prosecution's job to prove that a man who killed and ate children was sane. At one point, Dempsey attempted to pin down the prosecution's psychiatrist, Dr. Charles Lambert. He apparently wanted Dr. Lambert to admit that one or more of Fish's depraved activities, in this case coprophagia, or the eating of feces, were only practiced by the insane. When Dempsey asked how many cases in Dr. Lambert's experience had he seen people who actually ate feces, Dr. Lambert required, "Oh, I know individuals prominent in society, one in particular that we all know who used it as a side dish in his salad." I can just see that disgusted look of acceptance on some of your faces. Yeah, that's fine, as long as it was consenting, right? Now, by far, the most dramatic moment in the trial that must have already been a whirlwind of emotions for the jury was when District Attorney Gallagher produced a box containing the actual remains of Grace Budd. As Detective King recreated from Fish's confession the destruction of the child, Gallagher reached into the box and produced Grace Budd's tiny skull, which he thrust at the jury. Dempsey, of course, demanded a mistrial. He didn't get it. So, good job by Gallagher on that one. Throughout the trial, Fish appeared indifferent, and one source I found actually stated he nodded off at one point. Now, for personal experience in trials, when not being directly addressed by a member of the court, jury members will spend a lot of time looking at the defendant. They especially want to see reactions to important evidence and testimonies. We all like to believe that juries are impartial and wait until they have all the information before making a decision. But the truth is, they start their process of deciding guilt or innocence from the first time they lay eyes on the accused. It's just a basic popularity contest based on human genetics, and Fish failed it miserably. In the end, the 10-day trial took the jury less than an hour to find Fish guilty. Judge Close sentenced Fish to death in Sing Sing Prison's electric chair. Fish was not happy with the verdict, but thanked the judge for his sentence. What I believe was just the imagination of a sensationalist reporter, he wrote that Fish was excited about his electrocution. This just added to the legend surrounding the last days of Albert Fish, which we'll get to in a bit. Now let's talk about the other crimes. Not all of them, but two specifically. So before we get to the execution, two other crimes that Fish confessed to. Now keep in mind, he only confessed to these after he was sentenced to death for Grace Budd. So there is still nothing redeeming here, if that was even possible. On July 14th, 1924, 9-year-old boy named Francis McDonald was reported missing. He had not come home after playing catch with friends in Port Richmond, Staten Island. Two sightings of a man matching Fish's description occurred that day. One was by Francis's mother, who saw him walking near their home. She stated he mumbled to himself and made strange motions with his hands. She said everything about him seemed faded and gray, which was where the nickname the Gray Man came from. I assume that Fish followed Francis and his friends from there to Port Richmond, where he watched them play. A Staten Island farmer named Hans Keel made the second positive identification of Fish as he watched the children play. The other children said Fish called Francis over to him while they continued to play. A moment later, Fish and Francis were gone. When Francis's body was found mutilated in the woods, it had been reported that he was either hanging from a tree or covered by brush, and I'm not sure which is the case. But Francis had been savagely beaten and strangled with his own suspenders. He had suffered extensive lacerations to his legs and abdomen. His left hamstring had almost been completely stripped of flesh. When Fish later confessed to this crime, he stated he had intended to castrate Francis, but fled when he heard someone approaching. This to me seems more like a spontaneous crime with little planning. It also seems like an escalation crime, where he is attempting to perfect his fantasy. There's no telling how many more crimes he committed between this and his next admitted murder, but you will see more planning and ultimately no recovered body in the next case of Billy Gaffney. On February 11th, 1927, 4-year-old Billy Gaffney was playing in his apartment hallway with 3-year-old Billy Beaton. A 12-year-old boy, who possibly could have been Beaton's brother, was watching them. The 12-year-old went into his apartment to check on his crying infant sister, and when he returned, both the Billys were missing. He told Beaton's father, and the building was quickly searched. They found Beaton on the roof of the building, and he told his father the boogeyman had taken Billy Gaffney. This story added a nickname to Fish's resume. Another serial killer, Peter Kudzanowski, I've never heard of him, and I've heard of most, was initially suspected in the crime until a trolley motorman named Joseph Meehan saw Fish's picture in the newspaper and contacted police. He stated on February 11th he saw Fish with a crying boy on the trolley. His description of the boy matched Billy Gaffney. In Fish's confession, we can see more planning that closely mirrored the Grace Blood case. He took Billy to an abandoned house in the Riker Avenue dumps. He stripped him, tied his hands and feet, and gagged him with a dirty rag he found in the dump. He then burned his clothes and left the boy bound while he went home for the night. He gathered tools and actually made a cat of nine tails from a short handle, possibly from a broom, and a belt which was cut into 6 strips. Fish, I believe, hadn't perfected his method yet. He had the place picked out, but had to make and retrieve tools. He returned to Billy and whipped his behind until blood ran from his legs. He completely mutilated his face by removing his ears and nose, cutting his mouth from ear to ear, and gouging out his eyes. Fish stated he was dead at this point, and I wish that had happened much earlier than this. He stabbed Billy in the stomach and put his mouth to the wound to drink the blood. He then put Billy's nose, ears, and some slices of his belly in the bag he brought his tools in. He then dissected Billy in order to put him into 4 potato sacks weighted with rocks. He kept Billy's pelvic section just below the navel down to just below the buttocks, and he also put this in his tool bag. The weighted potato sacks he threw into pools of filthy water along the road to North Beach. Then it was back to his apartment and another disgusting recipe. This time he made a stew from the pieces of Billy's face and belly. He added onions, carrots, turnips, celery, salt, and pepper. And I hated most of these vegetables before this. He then removed Billy's genitalia from the pelvic section. He referred to these as his monkey and peewees, in a juvenile sense, I guess. He roasted Billy's behind in the oven with bacon and onions, disgustingly elaborating on the basting process. Fish stated it was better than any turkey he had ever eaten. He described the monkey or penis as sweet as a nut, but stated he could not chew the peewees, the testicles, and he threw these in the toilet. This last part of the statement about not being able to chew the testicles demonstrates it's the only failure to enjoy his fantasy. And it makes this statement more believable to me. Not to say that Fish did not do the things he said, but his obsession with the obscene letter writing, doing things to shock and disgust, makes you wonder about embellishment at least. Let's talk about some paraphilias, which are sexual abnormalities. Now, I've read that Fish holds the record for the most diagnosed paraphilias at one time, I would assume. I couldn't find that record online in Guinness or anywhere else, but I admit I didn't look too hard. Besides, if there is someone who was more deranged than Fish, I don't want to know who it is anyway. I'm lying about that. I probably actually do. Now, Dr. Wortham wrote that Fish demonstrated at least 18 known and some unknown paraphilias. Now, when you're inventing your own paraphilia, that's, I don't want to say impressive, but it's something. I guess we'll start with some of the known ones and then delve into Fish's creativity. First is sadism and his masochism. No shit. Okay, these things defined Fish's life, which is sexual gratification from inflicting pain or humiliation, or having pain and humiliation inflicted upon yourself, either by yourself or from someone else. Flagellation, which is sexual gratification from beating or being beaten. Fish would have his own children and their friends play a game where they beat him with a nail-studded paddle if he wasn't beating himself with it. Exhibitionism, sexual gratification from exposing one's genitals. Voyeurism, sexual gratification from observing others, as in watching the boys undress in bathhouses. Picarism, which is sexual gratification from penetrating the skin of another and himself. He penetrated himself between the scrotum and the anus with dozens of needles, which became embedded. Pedophilia, perversion for children, obviously. Coprophagia, which we mentioned earlier, consuming of feces. Urophilia, consuming urine or being urinated on. Fetishism, sexual gratification from a non-human object. Cannibalism, eating human flesh. Necrophilia, sexual gratification from abusing corpses. And hematolagnia, or lognia, I'm not sure which is sexual gratification from blood when he drank from Billy Gaffney. Now, this list could go on forever. I didn't cover all of them. But basically, if the word ended with an M or an A, Fish had it. Now, there are a couple of examples of Fish's behavior at the time Wortham couldn't categorize, at least that I was able to see. Fish said that he inserted a rose into his urethra by the stem. And after observing himself in the mirror for a time, he removed the rose and ate it. Now, I'm assuming that there are thorns on this rose, and I'm crossing my legs while I'm talking about this. The other thing was he would insert wool doused with lighter fluid into his anus and light it. I truly believe, as Fish lay in bed every night, he couldn't easily fall asleep until he thought of a new way to stimulate himself through his own pain or the suffering of someone else. Let's move on to his execution. There have been so many rumors and legends surrounding the end of Fish's life in Sing Sing's electric chair. That he was giddy with excitement over the thrill of electrocution. That he helped the executioner position the electrodes on his body. That due to his picarism fetish, the more than 24 needles, long embedded in his pelvic region, shorted out the electric chair. Over time, all of these things have been widely disproved. On January 16, 1936, Fish entered the death chamber at 11:06 p.m. He shambled and looked ill and resigned. He was fastened into the chair just like every other condemned man had been. There aren't any actual photos of Fish in the electric chair, as all of the fake ones I've seen show him with a full head of hair. It was common practice and also documented that his head was shaved close. The chair didn't short out, and if the possibility that the use of 2 jolts were taken to end his life started that rumor, it was also not uncommon for the first jolt not to stop a condemned person's heart. They might be unconscious, but if the heart's not stopped, they're not dead. And after a doctor's examination, A second, and I don't even know, possibly a third, jolt was sometimes needed. Fish's reported last words to the executioner were, "I don't even know why I'm here." That may make you think of an insane, delusional man who has no connection with reality. But remember, shortly before his execution, Fish provided his attorney with a document which the attorney would not release. The attorney said it was the most filthy string of obscenities he had ever read. Fish's love of obscene letter writing for sexual gratification was still present at the end. That's not an insane man. Or that's not someone who's lost touch with reality, let's say that. I think the statement more likely was that of a coward. At the end of his life, and he wished he was anywhere but where he was, in that chair. I hope that Fish's lifelong obsession with the Bible, which he tried to hide behind during the trial, made him truly believe with all his heart that he knew where he was headed as soon as that switch was thrown. And knowing what that place surely held for him, his love of pain had probably left him in the terror of those last few seconds. Now by 11:09 p.m., only 3 minutes since entering the death chamber, Fish was declared dead. That's all the time it takes to rid the world of a monster. Fish's actual victim count will probably never be known. I don't know how it possibly could. A detective associated with this case stated there were at least 15 child murders almost assuredly committed by Fish. Now that number was just from one of the 23 states Fish had lived in. And even his victims that didn't die still had their entire lives ruined from spending just a moment with that man. I call him a man, whatever you want to call him. In my mind, simple extrapolation easily puts his number of victims in the hundreds. Then you can add on the family members, who rarely are thought about in these instances, with the possibilities of guilt-ridden suicides, divorces, early deaths from addiction like alcoholism, etc. And you can keep on adding zero to Fish's number of destruction. So in conclusion, this monster gets an enthusiastic 10 middle fingers on my fuck you scale. And now you see why that triple whiskey was necessary. I'm going to take another drink real quick. Well, that's all I have for you tonight. I can't say that I hope you enjoyed the podcast, but I do hope you were informed by it. Stick with me, folks. We will get through this together. Now, everyone, be good and behave. This is Brian, and I look forward to joining you in the next podcast on Mad Cardigan Crime.